Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Regional Effort on Invasive Species and Climate Change Management. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs across the country. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely nonprofit, volunteer groups throughout the United States. Regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, and Rescape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Bethany Bradley. Dr. Bradley is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation at UMass Amherst. Dr. Bradley's research interests include how terrestrial ecosystems respond to anthropogenically driven changes, particularly interactions between invasive species, land use, and climate change. She aims to improve forecasting of future changes to ecosystems. Welcome, Dr. Bradley.
Thanks so much for having me. So the title of the webinar is a little bit different from the title of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll just say that the title that I have for today is Ecological Gardening with Climate Change to Prevent Future Invasions and Assist Native Migrations. And I'm speaking in part on behalf of a network that we've developed in the Northeast. So this is the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change or Risk Management Network. So we're doing a lot of work on trying to understand what the implications of climate change are for invasive species management, and then trying to do a better job of connecting research and management. So this webinar is some of the things that we've been thinking about because the climate change issue certainly intersects not just invasive species, but native species, and the choices that we make in terms of which species where we choose to move around or plant in our gardens will affect the winners and losers in the future with climate change. So I'll have a slide way at the end with some information on this network if you're interested in it, and how to sign up so that you're updated on our different activities. So what I want to talk about today, this is an outline, is first I want to give a little primer on climate change, just because some of the science behind climate change is really interesting to talk about. Then I want to talk about how climate change is affecting range shifts in species. And then I'm going to talk about the concept of assisted migration, so the costs and benefits of moving species in anticipation or in response to climate change. And then I'll wrap up with sort of a, some of the ironies of thinking about assisted migration versus what we're doing currently. So starting out with that primer on climate change. So rising CO2 that we are currently seeing is not normal relative to anything that's happened in the recent past. And when I say recent past, I mean what geologists mean by recent past, which is like millions of years kind of thing. So this graph here starts in the late 50s and continues up until today. And so what you can see here are atmospheric data that were collected on the top of the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, so really far away from human development in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and generally thought to be a very good measure of kind of general atmospheric conditions, as opposed to putting it next to LA or something like that. So we have risen from, and the record starts in the 50s, but if you go back to the 1800s, you end up down here someplace at about 280 parts per million of CO2. We're well over 400 parts per million today. And so how do we know that this is not a normal pattern? We know that largely by looking at paleo climate, so basically climate going back hundreds of thousands to millions of years. And one of the ways that paleogeologists study this is by looking at ice core measurements. So out in Antarctica, they were able, and there are some Greenland cores as well, but they were able to core down about 2-mile long ice core all the way down to the bedrock. So the thickest part of Antarctica is just a little thicker than that in terms of ice. So it's like 2.5 miles deep, they think, in the thickest place. They were able to get about 2 miles of that. And they have this super long ice core. And in that ice core, you have these air bubbles that have been trapped from thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so basically, on a year-to-year basis, kind of like the way that tree rings accumulate through growth, ice rings effectively accumulate too as ice and snow accumulate on the top of the glaciers, and you end up with these air bubbles back in time. And so you can actually go into those air bubbles and measure what the atmosphere was like hundreds of thousands of years ago. And these are some data from those ice sheets or the ice cores. And the way that this is 0 is like right now, and this goes back 800,000 years. This is that atmospheric CO2 concentration. So basically, what you're seeing here are interglacials and then glacial periods. So warmer generally, colder generally. If you go back to this point around here, that was the peak of the last glaciation. So where I am in Massachusetts was covered by about a mile of ice on top of us, right? And then here we are in this interglacial when all of that major glaciation melted, and here we are current. So this is how we know that this is way different from anything that we've seen going on for at least the past million years. And these are estimates of temperature, so warming, temperature, cooling temperature. That's not directly measurable from the ice cores, but it is indirectly measurable when you look at some oxygen isotopes that relate to basically warmer and cooler ocean temperatures. So this is the last 800,000 years or so. We can actually go back earlier in time to think in terms of, all right, this one is what the Earth has generally been like, glacier, interglacier, for the last million or so years. What could our Earth future look like with climate warming if we're up in this, like 400 and projections out to the end of the century of even double that in terms of CO2 concentrations? Well, we can learn something about that by looking even further back into paleoclimate. So if you go back about 65 million years, and now right here, this is the end of when we had any kind of glaciation, and unfortunately we can't dig an ice core so deep to get back 10 million years, only around here. But basically before this time period, when the equivalent temperature was about 4 degrees higher than it is today, 3 or 4 degrees higher, there was no ice on Earth. So back before this time period, we've got no polar ice caps whatsoever. The ocean was much higher, so the coastlines were quite different from what they look like today. And we even see like this past history when it was much warmer than it is today. But this is sort of the direction that we're headed with climate change. And one thing that paleoclimatologists look at a lot as an analog to current climate change is this thing, this PETM, which stands for the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And so what happened then, at the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, global temperatures rose by about 6 degrees Celsius over 20,000 years. During that time period, there was, and as far as I know, we don't know the actual cause of what exactly happened at this time, 60 million years ago or thereabouts, but we know the effects of it. There was mass extinction of a benthic foraminifera. So these are single-celled organisms in the ocean. There was also a large extinction of terrestrial mammals and a full loss of all carbonate life because of ocean acidification in the ocean. So it was about 6 degrees C over 20,000 years. We're currently looking at 6 degrees C rise over about 200 years with current projections of human-driven climate change. So definitely these kind of effects, mass extinction, we're right on the cusp of all of these effects happening on Earth because of our activities. So what does this rising CO2 mean for climate? So generally, rising temperatures, because you end up with a stronger greenhouse effect, more CO2 in the atmosphere means that we effectively add an additional blanket kind of thing over the Earth's atmosphere. And then also certainly altered precipitation, although that varies by region, as well as, I didn't put this on the slide, but changes in extreme events. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. So when we think in terms of how is climate changing, warming temperatures, longer growing seasons are virtually certain from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the last report. They're working on the 6th report right now. I don't know if there's anything more certain than virtually certain, but that's where we are as far as the temperature rises. So heat waves, more common. Also, so here's the extreme events. So more extremes is definitely something that is consistent. We've observed this already and is consistent in terms of projections of what future climate might look like. So on the left here, this is actually an observed records of hurricane intensity in the Atlantic. So you have this very clear trend in more extreme hurricanes, more intense hurricanes over the last 20 years. This paper was from 2007, so there's some updating to do, another 10 years worth of information. We've also seen, so interestingly, we see both more extreme droughts as well as more extreme flooding events. So the climatologists talk about that as sort of a peakier precipitation cycles, and oftentimes both of these two things, droughts and floods, are happening in the same place. So you could have, a period where you have multiple months with very little rainfall, and then a period where you have a lot of high magnitude precipitation events all happening in the same place. So what has been measured already? Now I'm into Fahrenheit. I should have changed the previous one to Fahrenheit instead of Celsius too. So temperatures are warming. This is a map from Massachusetts, which is where I'm from. So here's Massachusetts historically, right, in geographic space. This is where Massachusetts was if we measure Massachusetts climate during the 20th century, basically from like the late 1800s to the late 1900s when we have good temperature records. And then if you measure temperature after around 2000, so for the last 20 years or so, actually our temperature has already hit kind of the tri-state area. We're already more similar to New Jersey than we are to historical Massachusetts. And then the projections of what looks going into the future are either optimistic, if we can change behavior and energy uses quite quickly, or more pessimistic, which are consistent with the current trends in emissions. So by 2100, Massachusetts's climate could look more similar to South Carolina than it does to Massachusetts. So warming on average of about 6 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100 is the projection if we continue with sort of the business as usual, which we seem to be doing business as usual very well at present. So that means that in terms of species, so turning now into like what this means for plants and for other species, that means that if you're a plant from South Carolina, you need to effectively move to Massachusetts in order to by the end of the century, in order to maintain the climate that you're used to or that you've evolved under. So warming temperature is definitely going to be affecting species distributions. This is just an example because probably many of you have seen hardiness zone maps before. So hardiness zones are shifting. Hardiness zones are based on minimum temperatures. The historical sort of Arbor Day hardiness zone is on the left, and then this is a projection of what those hardiness zones would look like out to 2050. And in fact, this is a pretty optimistic projection at this point. It's likely that, so here I am in Massachusetts, it's quite likely that we'll be into sort of a 6, but on the cusp of 7 by mid-century already. That's quite a big change when we're starting, you know, at 5 in terms of hardiness zones. So temperatures are warming, species are shifting their ranges. We already know this in response. So there have been lots of different studies for the last 20 or so years looking at species range shifts. And so the way this is a more recent, I guess one of the more recent studies, although it's still 8 years old. What they saw in the study was on average a movement poleward of about 17 kilometers every 10 years. And a movement upwards of these bugs mostly, or insects mostly, of about 11 meters every 10 years. And just to show you sort of like what this graph means, the red on all of these graphs is the 0 point. So if the data, those like black bars behind it, fall on the 0 line, then that means that that spider or moth or grasshopper or beetle didn't move during the time period that they were measuring this. So it was a 25-year time period, and this is actually a study from the UK. And then the blue line, which is sort of the average for these different groups, insect groups or arachnid groups, that is how far these species did actually move. So that's where these numbers come from, these sort of averages of how far species are moving. So we already know species are already moving in response to climate change. Take-home point in terms of, and I'm going to come back to that species moving again, but the take-home point in terms of how is climate changing is that we know temperatures are rising. We also know that droughts, floods, and hurricanes are likely to become more extreme, and that this is all going to be affecting plants and animals. So in terms of thinking about those range shifts, right, where we just saw those different insects from the UK that are, in fact, you know, responding to climate change already. Another thing to think about in terms of range shifts is the speed at which climate change is happening. So climate change right now is happening super fast. I mentioned before that Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum 60 million years ago, right? That was a 6-degree Celsius rise over 20,000 years. We're now looking at a 6-degree Celsius rise over a couple hundred years. That is super fast. Species on Earth have never seen anything like this in their evolutionary history. So it's going to be a brave new world as far as you know, how species react. Climate change happening super fast. That means that if you have rapid change, you're favoring fast dispersing species. So this is just another, with different colors, map of Massachusetts historically, currently, and then sort of in our business as usual by the end of the century. This means that species have to move about 800 miles in order to keep up with climate. That's really far, right? So then the question is, well, how fast are species able to move? And there are a couple of really neat long-term studies that I just wanted to point out. One is came from Yosemite. So back in the early 20th century, a biologist, Joseph Grinnell, he was a huge collector, went out and collected a lot of plant, but especially small mammal specimens, and then took over 3,000 pages of notes documenting what he had found and where he had found it. And then in 2005, scientists from Berkeley and the USGS went into this like giant archive of notes and specimens, were able to go back and find the same locations that he visited now almost 100 years later, and do those same measurements. What do the small mammal populations look like? How many of them are there? Do we find these species in the same places? And what they found was that half of species ranges had shifted, so that's sort of consistent with some species being able to respond to climate change. that the expansion tended to be upward, also consistent with climate change, and that contraction tended to be from the lower edge. So basically they're shifting to higher elevations because those are now the temperatures that they were used to. So that's one example of a long-term study. Second example of a long-term study is one in Vermont, in the Green Mountains in southern Vermont. So this is a study over 40 years, where in 1964, the Forest Service put out some permanent transects up through the Green Mountains. And then in 2004, some researchers from the University of Vermont went back and remeasured those transects. So this is mainly looking at trees. And what they found was that sort of consistent with climate change, northern hardwoods, which were at the lower elevations before, were starting to move up a little bit into what had previously been boreal forest at higher elevations. And that the boreal forest margin had been also moving upward in response to climate warming. So a couple of examples of these long-term measurements. And so the question is, well, how fast are these native communities actually shifting? So the small mammal communities in the Sierras in California moved about 1,500 feet over 90 years. The forest trees in Vermont moved about 600 feet over 40 years. So the answer to that is they're not moving very fast. That most of these species are not going to be able to keep up with climate warming. In fact, we're not even close to keeping up with climate warming, because if we're moving 600 feet in 40 years and we actually need to move 800 miles in 100 years, like there's no chance that most native species are going to be able to move that kind of distance without some help. So that means that in terms of a take-home point here, if we want species to survive extinction, then we need to help them move. And these pictures on the bottom are from one of the kind of case study example species that has been promoted as sort of a poster child for assisted migration. And that's Torreya taxifolia, or I guess this one is Torreya californica, now that I actually read the picture. But Torreya as a genus is definitely one that, that has been identified as, so it's a cedar type of tree, as a potential for moving with assisted migration, because it has very small native populations that are likely to disappear with climate warming. So the solution that's been proposed by both scientists, managers, and the general public is this idea of assisted migration. So a definition of assisted migration is that this is the intentional introduction of species outside of their historic ranges and moving them into regions that are going to be more climatically favorable for them in the future. The idea is we help these species move before climate change makes them extinct in their local, where they started, basically. So the Torreya guardians, so this is the native range of that Torreya taxifolia tree. The idea is that they want to, this is a rare conifer, they want to try to move it up into different parts of the eastern temperate forest where the species can ideally currently persist, and then eventually when the climate conditions catch up to it, reproduce and have viable populations. So the idea of assisted migration, there's a range of things that have been discussed in this topic. They range everything from, the relatively conservative side, which is we don't want to move a species outside of its current range. We just want to try to increase the gene pool so that these sort of warm adapted species at maybe the southern end of the range, if we introduce those same warm adapted species at the north end of the range, then we increase the genetic capability to adapt to warming temperatures. So that's one possibility. You don't actually move a species outside of its range. You're just like aiming for the warm adapted ones to help them out. You can also think in terms of expanding ecological communities. So you move either one species or a group of species outside of what their current range is in anticipation of climate change. Another option is you just focus on a single species. So like that Torreya taxifolia is a good example of that, where it's a rare or threatened species, and we're trying to preserve this particular species, but we're not necessarily worried about the community. And so we're moving that single species outside of its current range. And there's been a lot of debate on about assisted migration in terms of the costs versus benefits of that. So the four main things that people tend to think about in terms of cost versus benefits are, first, the focal impacts. So that is it actually going to help the target species, right? So if we've got a rare and endangered species, is moving it going to help it sustain a population? The feasibility, so can we even grow this species? Will it accept translocation, or are we going to, invest a lot of money and then it dies instantly or something like that, right? That would be bad. I guess I'll skip to the bottom one, acceptability, right? Like, are people going to support this? Do they care a lot about that species such that they want to see it more widespread, or, or they don't like that species, so they're not going to like it. And then the cost being the collateral impacts. So what is the risk for the recipient ecosystem? Like, is it risky? And that's where the sort of like invasion ecology perspective comes in. So our worst case scenario, right, is one where a translocated species goes on to become invasive and has those really negative collateral damage, or whatever it was just called, collateral impacts, right, on the native ecosystem. So here's an example, black locust tree, which is native to these kind of green areas in the Appalachians in the central US, has been planted widely and is now considered invasive up at least in the Northeast. I'm not sure what other states it might be considered invasive. So that's our worst case scenario, and definitely something to be concerned about. And the question is, well, how concerned should we be about moving native plants around and them becoming invasive because of our action? So it turns out when you dig into this that native invaders are actually relatively rare in plants. This is from a study about 10 years ago that looked at basically just the whole pools of invasive species in the US, and then measured what percentage of those are originating from inside the US. And plants, it's less than 10%. So most of our invasive plants in the US are coming from outside of North America. It's very different from fish. So fish, I would say, are not a good candidate for assisted migration. Native invasive species are very common in fish. An example is the river herring, which is native to the east coast of the US and highly invaded in the Great Lakes because it's really competitive and it also alters food web structure. And so why are native invaders so common in fish and less common in plants? Well, one reason is because for fish, land is a pretty major barrier, unless you're that snakehead thing that like crawls over the land or something. But most fish don't get to walk on land. So that means that this distance, although relatively short for us, between the Hudson River and the Great Lakes, which are here, they're around here, is a huge barrier for fish. And so that means that on their own, there's just really no chance that those fish would have made it from one water body to another without human help. Plants are pretty different though. There's not that many not that many barriers for migration and for interaction of plants. And in fact, in kind of paleohistory, so Pleistocene is like 15,000 years ago. So this is during the last major ice age. This is for the Southwest, so Arizona and New Mexico. You can see that these two states looked very different just 15,000 years ago. Many of the same species are still around today, like all of these on here still around today. And you just have these species shifting and moving around kind of thing during that time period. So because plants don't have as many barriers, they're able to interact, and that means that they have this evolutionary history of interaction. And again, so why, here's another study from more recently, 2012, that looked at the proportion of non-native plants that have been introduced to the US that go on to be invasive. So about 3,000 non-native plants that we know of have been introduced to the US. 350 of those, so about 12% or thereabouts, have gone on to become invasive. In contrast, we know of 90 native plants that are invasive in the US, and there are about 18,000 native plants within the US. So really low, another way of measuring that, really low proportion of native invaders and plants. So that asks the question then of why are there so many more non-native invaders than there are native invaders? And here's where we can start looking at the science of invasion ecology to get a little bit more insight into what adds risk to the potential for invasive species. So why are non-natives so much more likely to become invasive? One reason is because of release from natural enemies. So this is actually a major hypothesis in invasion ecology called the enemy release hypothesis. And the idea is that if you are a native plant, there are lots of things that eat you. You have a shared evolutionary history with a bunch of different critters. And so you are constantly having a battle with whatever is eating you, where they eat you and you grow back, and they eat you some more and you grow back again, right? And this is not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, like, you know, most of those plants are still able to survive and flower and fruit and whatever they need to do. And it's actually really good because a bunch of those critters that are eating your native plants are becoming pollinators, they're becoming butterflies, and those are nice things to have to support an ecological community. And of course, this cascades up into supporting native birds as well, and anything else that would munch on all of these caterpillars. So in contrast, if you've got non-native plants in your garden, primarily those are not being eaten by native insects. So most native insects are specialists. So they specialize on only one species sometimes of plant, or they specialize on a genus of plants. And that means if you bring in a new, you know, a Japanese maple tree or whatever the heck that is, then they may have, you know, that's just way outside anything that they're interested or want to eat. So those don't support pollinators particularly well. They don't support native birds, etc. But the other thing that does is it means that the non-native plants have this kind of big advantage in that nobody's eaten them. They're not being introduced, for the most part, with predators or herbivores from their native range. So, you know, they're just like, hey, I can grow and nobody eats me. And so that means I can grow and grow and grow. And if you don't have those enemies, you can spend lots of time, all of your time, growing and reproducing. And that's something that can potentially contribute to species becoming invasive because their populations can grow out of control, not kept in check. Another reason why non-natives are more likely to become invasive is this idea of lack of coevolution. So remember that evolution is basically, it's a war going on out there, right? It's a constant arms race. So if you are, for example, a pathogen, then you are constantly trying to be, or I mean, I'm anthropomorphizing here, but like you are constantly evolving to be more virulent, to be able to infect more hosts so that you can reproduce and grow your population. And if you are a tree that pathogen is infesting, then you are constantly trying to resist that pathogen to, you know, the offspring that have more resistance to that pathogen are more likely to survive and go on to reproduce, right? It's sort of like classic Darwin. So that's great if you are, for example, a Japanese chestnut, and you have chestnut blight, right? You have had hundreds of thousands or millions of years of coevolution where like one side gets an advantage, another side gets and it comes back and forth and back and forth, to the point where you end up with something like chestnut blight in Japan that is pretty highly virulent, but Japanese chestnuts are, well, whatever, you know, like I've evolved the resistance to that. American chestnut, on the other hand, did not have that co-evolution with Japanese chestnut blight, right? And so that's why we don't have American chestnuts anymore, because they were all really susceptible to that chestnut blight, and it basically wiped them all out. So that piece of having some evolutionary history means that the more evolutionary history you have, the more likely you will have been to interact in the past, and therefore the more likely you are to like know your enemy, kind of thing, to have the arms, so to speak, to defeat or buttress yourself against whatever enemy is coming. And then a last reason why non-natives are so likely to become invasive is propagal pressure. So basically, we introduce a lot of non-natives in the nursery industry, and the more chances you give a plant or animal by introducing it and reintroducing it and reintroducing it, the more likely you are to hit that kind of sweet spot, whether that's in a climatic conditions, or whether it's, soil conditions, that you finally get it in the right spot when it could potentially expand its population and go on to be invasive. So take home points on this is that relative to introducing non-natives, the assisted migration of native plants is quite a bit lower risk. So not that we shouldn't be worried about introducing potential invasive species, but it's pretty low risk because of the fact that they still have their native enemies, the fact that we're not necessarily introducing them in mass quantities, and the fact that they have this evolutionary history with the plants and animals that are surrounding them broadly. So nonetheless, there's still, so over here, these invasive species, the ones that originate inside the US, so these are native invaders, are still likely to have high severity of impact, high severity of threat. And so that means that we shouldn't, ignore this completely as a problem. We need to consider some of those risks before we're moving things. And in particular, what we want to consider is this piece of collateral impact. So what is that risk for the recipient ecosystem? And so this is just taking some of those concepts that we just talked about from invasion ecology and putting them into a framework where you can identify kind of the relative risk for any given species that it might become invasive in a new terrain. And I'll just walk through those. So that first one, again, I just talked about these, but this is just sort of reiterating these points. Okay, if evolutionary history is really important, then what we want is to make sure that we're not taking a species and introducing it into a recipient ecosystem that has a totally unique evolutionary history, right? That would be bad. We want a species that, if we're moving species within eastern temperate forests, let's make sure that we're taking an eastern temperate forest species and not introducing it into savanna or into a grassland or something like that. So the closer the evolutionary history, and this is a phylogeny for butterflies that I just thought was really pretty, but basically what this means is, as you see these sort of color groupings, those are species that are more closely related, that you don't have to go back that far in time to find a common relative for them in evolutionary history, so that these species, these, two, whatever they are over here, are likely to have interacted recently or have evolved from, a similar ancestor, Whereas if you go way over here and you compare this one to that one, you have to go back a long time in evolutionary history before they would have a common ancestor, or they would have been interacting. And so that gives you higher risk, that risk of surprises, basically. What we want is to minimize surprises. And this has a geographic component too, right? The closer you are geographically, the fewer barriers to movement between you, then the more likely either those two species or communities or their ancestors are to have interacted. Then we can think in terms of the species itself, right? So we know also from invasion ecology that there are traits that affect the likelihood of a species, a plant species especially, becoming invasive. So those are things like weedy characteristics, right? Response, if they respond very positively to disturbance, if they do things like nitrogen fixation or change the chemistry, have strong allelopathy where they, put out chemicals in their roots to kill competitors. Those are all examples of ones where it's like, this could have just because of its traits, have strong negative effects. Black locust is a good example of that. If you look at it in its native range, it's relatively weedy for a tree. It's pretty common. It is a nitrogen fixing tree. It tends to survive well in disturbed areas. So those are all traits that kind of raise some red flags about likelihood of becoming invasive. And then what else should we consider? So rare or threatened native ecosystems, right? So we want to be careful in terms of translocating species for assisted migration into a recipient ecosystem that's rare or threatened. So all of this is to say that we have thought about this a fair bit, the scientific community being we, and we know ways to reduce risk of creating new problems with assisted migration. That doesn't mean that we remove risk, but it does mean that we can reduce it quite a bit. And another point on that, just to, a lot of times we focus very heavily on our concern for the idea that we should first do no harm, that moving species around we're likely to mess up, which is true. But we also need to bear in mind that doing nothing is doing harm. We are on the cusp of a mass extinction. If we do nothing, that mass extinction is going to be worse. So here's the irony part of all this, right? We're already doing assisted migration with nursery plants. So this is an example from Europe. This red range over here is the native range of this plant, rock soapwort, and all of these little green dots all the way up into Scandinavia are nurseries that are selling that plant in Europe, right? So being sold much further north than its current range. So this is good. This is a plant that's native to Europe. It's likely that it has some shared evolutionary history with stuff up there. In fact, the last glaciation, which went down about this far, may well have pushed it out of this range. So this is an example of this is good for native species if we're doing this with the nursery trade. The problem is that most nursery plants are not native plants like that example. Instead, they are non-native plants. And in fact, the majority of invasive plants were introduced via an ornamental plant pathway. So 53% of invasive plants were introduced as ornamentals. We know that we're much better at dispersing plants than plants are alone. So if we're planting bamboo or driving around a boat with whatever the heck that is hanging off the back of it, that means that we're giving these species a win in terms of assisted migration. Another piece of this is that new plants, so ones that aren't here yet or are just coming in to the industry, those are constantly arriving through nursery imports. And these red ones on this particular map, these are all ones where the sources are increasing rapidly. So they're started out relatively low, but in the early 2000s at least, had a big increase in partnerships, so exports from those countries to the US. And the irony here being that most of those nursery imports or exports to the US, those species are coming from countries that are generally warmer than the US. So all of those emerging sources, this is in terms of hardiness zone, so this is the warm end. They are disproportionately skewed towards this warm end where our established sources are kind of all across the board. And those plant imports are also bringing with them warm adapted pests and pathogens. So this is just a graph showing that if you look at all of the invasive sap feeders, sap suckers, and leaf munchers of the invasive species world, they are mainly coming in on live plants. So that's the green on here. And that we've got lots of infested nursery plant shipments with those types of insects. So all of that is to say that species that we're cultivating, releasing, moving around in our gardens have a huge advantage in terms of their future populations being viable as climate is changing. And unfortunately, most of those species that we are choosing to move around, plant, cultivate, release tend to be non-natives, and that those non-natives are much more likely to go on to be invasive. So this whole idea, what I find, the idea of assisted migration and our concern with performing assisted migration, while it makes sense to be cautious from a scientific standpoint before, like moving everything around, all across the board, when you juxtapose that against what we're already doing, which is moving all of these non-native and invasive species around so that they'll have an advantage with climate change, all of that strikes me as kind of crazy, and that we need to do a much better job as homeowners, as gardeners, of keeping our focus on those native plants and helping the native plant populations move. If we could give natives the same advantage that we give to non-natives, that would be an amazing win. So I'm getting to the end here. So if you've got some final questions to submit to Penny, now is the time to do that. I've got 3 more slides. So this is just the conclusion of this whole thing, that native plants, because of the speed and the magnitude of climate warming, are not going to be able to, and are not currently able to, keep up in terms of their range shifting. And so we need to do something like assisted migration if we want to save those species. That assisted migration of plants, at least, is relatively low risk, and we kind of know the things that make it higher risk, so if we're smart about it, we should be able to minimize that risk even more. The irony here is that we're already assisting the migration of non-native and invasive plants, so we're giving them a climate advantage that we're withholding from our native plant communities. And then this last point, just to think about, that the species of the future, the ecosystems of the future, depend on the propagules, so the plant parts and the seeds that are here today. So you can't have a community in the future unless you've got the seeds to start it today, which means that our choices in terms of gardening, with keeping ecological landscaping in mind with our gardens, those choices make a big difference in terms of what ecosystems of the future will look like. Right now, the status quo is that ecosystems of the future look pretty weedy and invasive, and we have the opportunity to change that, to focus more on helping assist the migration of native plant communities. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but what can you do? Look for local plant species. That doesn't necessarily mean coming straight from your state or your county. It could be thinking about states or counties that are a little bit further to the south in terms of the native range, that have a little bit warmer plant hardiness zone, so that you're actively assisting migration. And then lastly, I'm just going to leave this slide up. If you want to know more about the invasive species and climate change sort of science or science management partnership, I'd really invite everyone to join our risk network, and you can join the listserv to get updates. The information is here, and then our website is at the bottom. And thank you very much for listening. So I think we can open it to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bradley. We do have a few questions. The first is, in the 2005 study that you mentioned, did they identify native species that had moved into the research site, or just the species that moved out of the research site into higher elevations?
I think that's the Sierra study that's referring to. They went back, so they basically identified all of the locations that Grinnell had gone to 100 or so years ago, and they went back to all of those sites and remeasured them. And so some of those sites were like at the high elevation end, and so they were able to see new species moving in, and some of those sites were at the lower elevation end, and so they saw like a loss of some species that moved higher up in elevation. And I'm not actually sure how many sites there were that were actually measured, but I could definitely go back to the paper and find out.
All right. How are the assisted migration target species being identified? And a follow-up question, will there be lists distributed for recommendations for what species we should be looking for in nurseries and trying to introduce into our designs?
That is an awesome question. As far as I know, most of the assisted migration discussions have been happening within, sort of state and federal forests and parks, and they've been in terms of like restoration species. So I think this is, I don't have recommendations for species, but I think that's a fantastic question. And, we're just kind of getting started with this as a topic that I need you guys, or we need all of us to join in this conversation in terms of recommendations for species. I would say the best people to talk to would be some of your natural area managers close to wherever you are. See if they've been thinking about assisted migration and what types of species they've been looking at. In some cases, native species that are best candidates for assisted migration aren't necessarily going to be in like the ornamental plant production. They might instead be in some of the restoration sets of species that are being developed for restoration and conservation. So it might be a slightly different source, and I'm way outside of my expertise now. So but I love the question, and I hope we can move forward getting more information about recommendations for species.
All right, thank you. Why is black locust not invasive in its warmer native area?
So I don't know a whole lot about black locust, actually. So I believe that it is kind of weedy in its native range. And that's kind of just a terminology thing. So when we use the term invasive, usually that has with it the definition that it's non-native. With climate change and everything moving around, what non-native means gets really fuzzy fast, right? Like, oh, if it's from this county and not that county, does that mean it's non-native to the other one? Or do we only mean, North America versus Asia or something like that, right? So I believe that black locust is pretty weedy in its historic range in the Appalachians already. And it's just that because it's been there for a long time, whatever the kind of quote unquote impacts it would be having on the ecosystem have already been felt. And so it's part of the kind of baseline measurement. And as as that one was moved around, it was having negative impacts on native rare species in the Northeast, and therefore was cause for concern.
All right. You mentioned several studies and talked about various native plant invaders. And the question is, do you know what common definition was used in this research? Was it native by date or by locale or some other definition?
Yeah, so that goes back to this real challenge of talking about what native and non-native means. And I feel like the scientists are still really hashing out that question, that a lot of people have very different perspectives on what it means. I would say that if we're talking about assisted migration, then using the term native is problematic because all of these species need to move. So if we call it a non-native and we think of that as like a bad thing, then we're not going to be helping species move around. I think if we think about it in terms of risks of weediness or risks of negative impacts or something like that, then that is a better framing on it rather than trying to nail down what native and non-native mean. Because yeah, the idea of using baselines in a changing climate is not a good long-term strategy. You know, we cannot be going back to pre-Columbus or indigenous peoples arriving in North America or whenever our park was formed or something like that as a baseline when the future is going to be totally different.
All right, that's very good. The next question is about helping with assisted migration. There are many people creating pollinator gardens, and one question is, should we be looking at plants from warmer hardiness zones and selecting plants for pollinator habitat? And will pollinators be part of this assisted migration?
Ideally, they would be. Ideally, assisted migration encompasses an ecosystem. Starting out, it makes sense to focus on the more rare species that are threatened directly by climate change, but ultimately, total ecosystems are threatened by climate change. So, yeah, I think that would be a positive thing if you brought some more southerly, warm adapted species into a pollinator garden and saw some more southerly, warm adapted pollinators, then that's what you would want.
And then we should all take field trips and go gather caterpillars.
That sounds fun.
Okay, the next question. Are there considerations beyond plants and insects? Are there other studies on invertebrates that you are aware of?
I am a plant person, so if there are, I'm not super familiar with them. I mean, there are definitely, like that Sierra study was mainly focused on small mammals and maybe some reptiles. The one from the UK was focused on insects and spiders. So there have definitely been studies of those. I just am not familiar with them.
All right. And we have just one final question. Do native invaders that are from the U.S. share traits that have been evaluated in a way that we can use that as lessons for what plants we consider bringing north?
Awesome question. Yeah, so that Simberloff study, which looked at the native invaders, it was a 2012 study. The main thing that they saw was disturbance responsiveness. So basically, weediness kind of thing. You know, if you disturb a site and you see a high abundance of whatever that plant is, then those were the ones that were more likely to be on that list. As far as I know, they didn't do much beyond, like, that was the thing that really rose to the top. And I don't think that they looked at any kind of more specific plant traits, like, you know, like, I don't know, nitrogen fixation or leaf economics or whatever those things. I don't think they looked at those, but that would be pretty cool to do, to see if the native invaders are different.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing all of this necessary but really quite alarming information. It gives us a lot to think about, a lot of emphasis to learn more, and certainly to pay attention when we hear of any projects or discussions about assisted migration in our own areas, that we would want to keep up with that and try to pay more attention. So thank you for sharing this research, Dr. Bradley. I very much appreciate you being part of our webinar series.
Thanks.